Welcome to the UP Notable Books Club, brought to you by the Upper Peninsula Publisher and Authors Association. J.D. Austin was raised in St. Louis, Missouri, and has been moving gradually north since the age of 14. After dropping out of college in November of 2019, he worked as a kayak guide, wedding server, bar security, lighting designer, stage carpenter, ski technician, and in a nursery department at Home Depot. His fiction has appeared in the Incandescent Review and the U.P. Reader Volume No. 7. The Last Huck is his first novel, and his most recent book, What You Find in the Woods, is a collection of short stories about the Upper Midwest.
So I am very tickled to have Jack with us tonight. We're going to be talking about The Last Huck. Our library book copies are out. So that's why I'm referring to this. And next month, we are going to be doing How to Hike the North Country Trail, Not Quite a Guide. So that's going to be kind of a fun book to talk about, and that will be with Joan Young. So Victor now always spends a few minutes talking about UPPAA. So take it away, Victor. Tell us what's new with UPPAA.
All right. Thank you, Evelyn. The big thing going on this time of year is always the run-up to next year's UP Reader. UP Reader, which I have a copy right here with me, is our anthology of writings from all of our members at UPPAA that have contributed poetry and short stories and sometimes biographical memoir material. Now, to contribute to UP Volume 10, starting right now, you just have to become a member of UPPAA. Go over to UPPAA.org and you can sign up. It says a little button there says become a member, and you'll be eligible to submit a work for consideration. It's we have a dedicated number of jurists who read each and every submission, and so we're very proud of the quality of work that we're getting. This year, in 2025, the first year we've gone to a color format, so we have lots of beautiful color photos to highlight the poetry and short stories and everything that goes into this book. So if it's a great way for writers to get started. We know Sarah Moore, who just got a contract signed with St. Martin's Press. She started in the UP Reader, and she's going to be keynoting our conference in 2026. So there are UP Reader success stories abound. So head over to www.uppaa.org. Thank you, Evelyn.
Okay, thanks, Victor. And I just want to tell everyone who's on that Jack here was on, of course, with me and Victor a little bit before you, and we had some technical difficulties. So he's switched from his laptop to his phone, and he's outside. So I think I heard a motorcycle go by.
You might have heard that, yeah.
So that I'm just alerting the audience that that's kind of better than not hearing him at all. So we might have a little bit of traffic sounds, but I wanted to welcome Jack, J.D. Austin, the author of The Last Huck, to our meeting tonight. I don't know about you guys, but I just finished the book late last night, early this morning, and I thought it was really good. And I've got a lot of questions and things I want to know about, but I'd love to hear from you first. So Jack, if you want to kind of start us off, and then we'll probably kind of chip in later.
Sure. So The Last Huck started actually as a short story draft that I did after a weekend sitting around the campfire with some buddies. I had just read the Raymond Carver short story called Where I'm Calling From, which is about two guys sitting on the front steps of a drying out facility is what it's called in the story, but essentially a rehab center for alcohol. And I had sat around the fire all weekend with my buddies in the UP on a farm very similar to the farm in the book. And we had been talking about, I think actually, about a buddy who was about to get married to somebody who we all didn't approve of. And we were all just sort of sitting around the fire all weekend saying like, hey, how are we going to express to our friend that, like, I don't know, or do we even express to him our misgivings, or how do we even handle the situation of like a dear friend from childhood who we aren't so close to anymore, but we were very, very close to when we were kids, embarking on making a huge decision in his adult life that we weren't entirely sure of, or like, do we even express this at all? How do we handle this whole situation? And so I got to thinking about writing a story about that climaxed around a couple of guys sitting around a fire or two guys specifically sitting around a fire trying to imagine how they were going to express something very difficult to a third buddy, a third dear friend. And I started drafting it, and I talked it over with my friends and my father, who's a very close consultant in all things writing. And the story just kept growing and growing. And one of my heroes, or my greatest literary hero, is John Steinbeck, and he always wrote so intimately about people's connection with the land, mostly in California, but also in Oklahoma. And I got to thinking about what essentially is the great sort of connection, the essence of the great connection, and the essence of the great sort of sadness which comes from the disconnection with the land of the people in the UP. And there are obviously lots of different stories, but I think the core truth is that people came here looking for work and looking for a better life from primarily Finland, but all over Europe, Italy, England. And as the 21st century rolled around, and even in the latter half of the 20th century, it became incredibly difficult to maintain that connection with the land as technology sort of started taking over everybody's lives. And I wanted to really write a story that got to the heart of that disconnection and what was going on with this incredibly intense, emotional, intimate relationship between a people and a culture and a place, and how it was sort of slowly dissolving in the face of modernity. And so that's really where the book came from. And as it grew and grew, it became a lot more about my own relationship with my childhood as a young adult. I just turned 26. My friends' relationships with their childhoods are the way our memories of our childhoods have changed and been warped and been made complicated by the sadnesses of growing older and the complications of growing older. Life, it seems to me that life only ever gets more complicated. And again, I'm sure it's going to keep getting complicated for me for a long time. I'm only 26. But around in my early 20s, I think, especially when I was writing this book, there was a really intense and yet kind of also vague sadness that was connected to memories of the simplicity of being a young boy in the North Woods, running around the North Woods in the summer mostly, and feeling just this kind of pure joy and pure belonging that hasn't necessarily gone away, but it's gotten a lot more complicated. And when you grow older, you got to start paying bills, and you got to start paying taxes, and relationships. For me, most of my friends, our relationships with women have gotten a lot more complicated, and our relationships with our parents and our relationships with our eventual children. All of these things sort of loom, and sort of like the concept in physics of entropy. Things go from states of order to states of disorder. And I think this book thematically really tries to address what it's like to have your first real inklings of like, oh man, I'm an adult now. What does that mean? In the book, obviously, I don't know whether it should spoil it or not, but there's the great question of, do we sell this piece of land that we've inherited from our forefathers? It's been in the family for generations. And the book ends up really becoming about, is sort of holding on with kind of a chokehold to the beautiful memories of our childhoods worth the kind of comfort and ease and safety and freedom that comes from eventually parting with a piece of land. And, you know, the stories of selling the family farm abound in the UP, and lots of readers have come up to me at farmers markets and at events around the UP. People who have read my book or even just read the back and have said, you know, oh, this is my family's story. And that's been very gratifying, to be honest, because I'm not from the UP. My family's never had to sell our UP family farm, although my family has sold family farms before. And so this wasn't necessarily my story or my family's story, but it was the story I really observed with my friends and neighbors from the UP. And I think it works really well in my effort to describe what it's like to mourn the loss of your childhood, you know, because it's for lots of people up here, losing connection with the land is sort of synonymous with losing the kind of simplicity and sensibility and deep sort of unified purpose and clear cutness, I suppose, of life as a child. And that as we've strayed further and further and further away from relying on the land for our livelihoods, our lives have been more and more and more and more complicated, have gotten more and more complicated. And so now that, you know, it's 2025 and it's hard not to get political, you know, life is becoming deeply, deeply complicated as we stray further and further away from connection with the land and more dependent and reliant on and intertwined with technology. And technology doesn't redeem your human soul in the same way that connection with the land does. This is something, frankly, I'm struggling a lot with right now. It's just being so tapped into the world on the other side of a screen. And it trades a short-term kind of dopamine hit or high for long-term fulfillment and health and enjoyment and the kind of real sort of deeply, I guess, unified and connected, the kinds of things that make you feel one with the universe. You know, technology makes you more of an individual and less of part of a whole. And I think all as humans, we all yearn to be connected and feel connected with the universe and the world around us and the lakes and the rivers and the birds in the sky and our friends and our loved ones and our community. And our screens just serve to isolate us and sort of wall us in from the world that we're really meant to be connected to. And I didn't really address the screen stuff in the book for a lot of reasons, but mostly just because it's so complicated. And the book came out to about 200 pages. And I just didn't even begin to know how to address the world online and the world of social media and the world of screens in a 200-page book. And so I sort of left that to future books. But the book really explores the part of it that it's like, what do you do with yourself and your life and your mind and your psyche when you have to part ways with a piece of land you grew up on, and have to trade that for the kind of financial resources that you need to be an adult, but that can't make you happy, can't ever fulfill you. And I think that answer is, I don't think that question is really fully answered in the book. It's just sort of explored from every direction. But I think a major takeaway that I want people to, that I want my readers to really come away from the book with is that I really do believe that the further we stray away from connection with the land and with the environment and with our communities is sort of goes alongside with straying away from ourselves and who we are inside. If you wall yourself off from the world with screens, you're walling yourself off from the community and your environment and the natural world, but you're also walling yourself off from yourself. And speaking personally, there's no worse feeling than being disconnected from yourself, and sort of forgetting who you are and not feeling unified. Because I think there's a really, I'm forgetting the exact translation, but it's an African word, Ubuntu, which translates to the I in you and the you in me. I'm pretty sure I'm getting that right. I might be wrong if there's any fact checkers out there. But I think individuality is ratified and made more whole, and made whole just in general, and made complete. Like, the individual becomes the fully realized individual in the context of community with other humans and community with the earth. And the further away we get from that kind of community and that kind of connection with the earth and with our people, the further we stray from connection with our own selves. And again, this is not exactly a time in history when, like, I have a lot of positive takeaways with regard to, like, where society is and how we're doing with those problems in America in 2025. But I do think that the answers are right in front of us, and the answer to, what we need is something we've already had. There's this sort of a mantra that I learned in when I was in treatment a while back, that all we need, we have right here. And I think that was understood perhaps best of all in terms of, like, all of human history by by Native Americans, by the indigenous American people, and the Anishinaabe specifically in the U.P. They understood that all they needed was provided for them by the earth, by the creator, whether it's God or whether it's the universe or whatever your specific sort of beliefs align with, that nothing man-made is gonna give you what you need. Everything you need comes from the earth and comes from the universe. A human life is obviously, like, you got to have two parents to be born. But human life has always been around, since we were primates. You don't need Twitter. You don't need your computer. You do need it these days. And I think that's part of why society is struggling so much right now, is because we've arranged a world in which we're more dependent on man-made things than we are on things made by the universe. And again, at risk of getting into the political weeds, I think the solution to communal health is the same solution to individual health, and that's relying and becoming one with and cooperating the rhythms of the universe and the things that are eternal. And obviously nothing's eternal. The earth is gonna combust one day. But the things that are, and again, this word gets into sort of some philosophical weeds, but relying on things that are natural, relying and depending on things that grow and change and are, organic, that aren't man-made, that relying on an entirely human-made sort of assortment of items, just makes you vulnerable to all sorts of sicknesses and all sorts of sets of problems that just aren't an issue when you're working in harmony with the universe. And so I think, again, getting back to the book, The Last Huck really sort of examines what it looks like for a group of young men who sort of have to say goodbye to their childhoods and have to say goodbye to a piece of land all at once. And, they come back up for one last weekend on the family farm. And they're just forced to confront all of the ways in which they've strayed from the things that they understand deep in their bones matter most. You know, and it's difficult, but they're making a great sacrifice for the sake of their futures in the modern world. You know, and they're making this trade-off to sell this piece of family land, to protect their families and to take care of their families and to take care of their future selves. And that if it's an indictment of anything, I hope it to be an indictment of the way society as a whole has organized itself around man-made things and not things that are born naturally out of the universe. I think that it's really, really hard to make all sorts of decisions these days because you have to weigh your own individual personal well-being and safety and financial stability against things that really call to you naturally. But sometimes, no matter what, you have to make decisions that your childhood self would be ashamed of. And there's a great sort of pain and disconnection and longing and sadness and confusion that comes from betraying your childhood self, because I feel like, you know, Shakespeare said the child is the father of the man. And you know, I think a text I come back to over and over and over again when thinking about childhood and adulthood is The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And The Little Prince does a really good job of illustrating all of the ways in which you lose sight of what's important when you grow old. But now that I'm doing a bit of growing old myself, I'm realizing that no, it's not necessarily just losing sight of things. It's you realize that there's other stuff out there, and that the whole time you were a kid, there was somebody paying the bills and putting food on the table. And in order to pay the bills and put the food on the table, you kind of have to bend the knee to society, and you have to play by society's rules. And if you find yourself getting sicker and sadder and more confused when you're playing by society's rules, that's really society's problem. And you know, we can get all bent out of shape blaming individuals for not being able to be very organized and be very good at modern life. I'm definitely not very good at modern life. Like I would, you know, here I am at a coffee shop, my computer's connection didn't work very well, you know, I don't really understand these things very well. And I would say that, like, as a sort of member of the 21st century world, like I'm 26, I'm of the age where I'm supposed to be able to fix people's computers and TVs and diagnose problems on people's phones. And I'm supposed to be the one helping my parents figure out their technological issues. And it's the opposite. My parents helped me figure out technological issues. And, you know, that's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, you know, I've published 2 books, or Victor's published 2 of my books. Thank you so much, Victor. You know, I think I wouldn't have been able to take the long, slow approach to writing fiction that I have if I were more equipped to deal with the modern world and better at computers and better at, you know, technology and better at just living a modern life, which involves an incredibly complicated system of lots of communicating with people that you never see face to face. I'm just so bad at things that aren't in person and brick and mortar. But on the flip side of that, I feel a connection to old literature that is that I wouldn't trade for the world. You know, and a connection to Steinbeck, who died, I think, almost 60 years ago, maybe 70 years ago. And, you know, a connection to Tolstoy, and a connection to E.M. Forster, and a connection to these men who had such an intimate and beautiful and redeeming connection to the world around them. And, it's hard exactly to understand what that means in terms of what I should do, how I should live my life. But I think writing fiction is in a lot of ways sort of an act of protest, a way of pushing back. I think I say this to a lot of people that if I had been born 30 years ago, I would have been a filmmaker. But now that, Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime and, film and TV and television shows are all that people spend their time with in terms of their fiction time. People spend the vast majority of their fiction time in front of a screen. And I think writing fiction for me is a way of pushing back against that and protesting a little bit and saying, no, I'm going to dig my heels in and say that we should spend our attention wisely and that we should do things that are in a way a lot more ancient and universal than things that are based on screens. I think to wrap this sort of spiel up and open it up to questions, I think the biggest question that's asked in the book, it isn't necessarily answered, is, how do you reconcile your dreams as a child with your reality as an adult? And there are answers offered in the book. I don't think they're necessarily the answers that are right for real life. But I think at its core, the book is about two young men who have to make an incredibly difficult decision to choose to be adults and to say goodbye to the children they once were, which is heartbreaking. I don't know if the book always reads as heartbreaking, but it's heartbreaking to me. When I think about the book and I think about the story, it's a heartbreaking story. But it's everyone's story. We all have to, if we're lucky enough to survive to be adults, we all have to at some point say goodbye to the children we once were. I don't know. I'm curious if anybody's read it, what you guys think about that. I don't know. Should we open it up to questions?
Sure. Well, I just got goosebumps on my arm. Listening to you for the last 20 minutes, it was like going to church. I don't know, like you had all these really profound comments about the world and how we all have to adjust to the way things have changed. But I suppose, we could talk about that forever. We probably should talk about the book. But one thing, I read the book, and I will say that when it got towards the end, like to me, the last 40, 50 pages, it was really kind of bloomed. And I think what got me is when, not Peter, the other one,
Nicholas.
Yes, called his dad. And the dad did not take it as bad as how he thought he would. And the dad was so good. And it was almost like the dad knew he was going to call. Oh, wow. That was great. That was really, really good. It was good. It ended just, I thought it was heartbreaking. I don't know if others read it and felt the same, or if anybody has questions or comments, but to me, that was like the little turning point, like that call with did you feel that when you wrote it?
Not necessarily. I've never thought about it that way, but I can totally see what you mean. I think that's an instance where a much more seasoned adult knows what life is about and sort of understands what his son is going through and has perhaps been through a little bit of it himself before. And perhaps maybe anticipates that a little bit, that, I think another one of my literary heroes is Anton Chekhov. And one of the sort of great things that I feel whenever I'm reading a Chekhov play or a Chekhov story is things are working toward an inevitability, that you should kind of know what's going to happen in a story or a play right from the get-go. But then that sort of, when it finally does ultimately happen, it makes it sort of that much more heartbreaking, that like you knew what was going on the whole time, and the characters even sort of know what was going to go on the whole time. and yet it still happened, and yet in spite of all of what we know about human life, tragedies happen every day, and more often than not, they're tragedies that we brought on ourselves. I think that inevitably what the climax of the book is at least in my eyes, is the scene when Nicholas and Peter, toward the end, Nicholas decides to this sort of harebrained, ridiculous, out of left field scheme to cut down a tree from the property, and he was going to use the wood from the tree to make a piece of furniture as sort of a keepsake, which of course is kind of an absurd idea, that people, that these guys like Nicholas has the idea in part because he does live in a city and doesn't really understand what rural life is really like. But then they're cutting into the tree, and as they cut into the tree and as the saw bites through the rings, the time sort of slips into the past, and the whole story of the piece of land is sort of told in a couple of pages. And that, for me, was the sort of point of inevitability that I wanted the novel to work towards, was that, the story of any family and a piece of land is ultimately going to be a tragedy, and there's this great biography of David Foster Wallace that's titled "Every Love Story is a Ghost Story," and that title really speaks to me about sort of just life, that every love story really is a ghost story, and that's something that's incredibly tragic about being human, but it's also sort of redemptive in a way that, you can understand when any beautiful thing is alive, that it's beautiful because it's alive temporarily, and it's not going to be forever, and it's going to die one day, and then it'll come back again in some new form, and then it'll die again, and then it'll come back again. And sort of just like, you cut down a tree and seeds spread and new trees grow, that sort of connection to the natural cycle of things is both sad and redemptive. And I think that when it comes to literature, that sort of pattern, that sort of sense of inevitability in a story or a novel is really essential, and really is cathartic, I think, a lot. And for me, at least, is that you get to the end of a story and you're sort of clutching your head, like, why did it have to go like this? Why did it have to be like this? But, I don't know about you guys, but going through life almost every day, I clutch my head, and it's like, why does it have to be like this? Why do I have to be like this? And sometimes those questions aren't meant to be answered until we're dead, and then when the cycle is complete, you can finally have perspective, or your loved ones can finally have perspective and look back on things and offer some sort of meaning, but I don't know where I got this from. I'm forgetting, probably an important source I should cite, but somebody once said that, like, I guess this idea sort of comes from Steinbeck a lot, is that the first day that anybody can have anything sensible to say about a person's life is the day after they die. That nothing sensible can be made out of a life until it's absolutely over and the body's in the ground. And I think a story should be the same way. You can't, no sense can be made of a piece of literature until it's all the way done. And in that way, I think inevitabilities sort of need to come to fruition, because inevitabilities and the sort of tragedy of fighting our own prophecies only to make our prophecies come true is an essentially human story, and the story that we're all living out every day. Yeah.
Oh, Mary has a question.
Absolutely.
Right now I'm in Washington State, so I'm a former Michigan resident for 19 years, and I could really relate not just to the story of the connection to the land in the UP, but to connection of land with land in general, because I recently wrote a book about the Irish potato famine. And one of the things that I learned was how strong the Irish were connected to their land, and that doubled the tragedy of what happened to them in the potato famine and having to leave. And then the same thing happens to indigenous peoples almost everywhere here in the US, all over the place. And being taken away from, for me, that I got taken away from my childhood land when I was only 11 years old and never was able to go back. And Evelyn, I want to introduce you to my son, who I'm visiting here because he lived in Crystal Falls for a while with Sword Schmidt. So this is John.
Hello.
John.
So, yeah, this is John. And he is a teacher, but he is one of those people that has a strong connection to the land. His favorite thing is being outdoors and teaching kids about the outdoors and taking them places. And
Summer 15 of outdoor ed.
yeah, he worked 5 summers at least at Fortune Lake Lutheran Camp. And then here in Montana, 5 summers at least at Flathead Lutheran Bible Camp. So actually now he's in Washington.
Yep.
And looking to do more of the same. And
Parks and Rec right now.
Yeah.
For them.
So he's going to get to take kids wading through tide pools and kayaking things. And if only there was something that could happen all year round.
Yeah.
And it's odd because that was exactly what I wanted to do when I was in college. And so it's kind of like that wavelength thing. But I could really relate to this book because of that idea of the loss of those things and how you have to learn to cope with what the world is throwing at you. And I wanted to thank Jack Austin for that book because it really did. At first, I had a little trouble relating, since I'm 72 years old, to some of the drug situation, but that didn't stop me. And as I got more and more into it, and I have to say that scene where they were cutting through the rings of the tree really meant a lot. And I agree with you. I think that was kind of like a culminating scene. And
the tree was amazing. That was, just as a writer, that was such a neat symbol to use to tie your story together. I really liked it. I was wondering, does anyone else have any questions? But thank you, Mary. Questions or comments about the book that, they read the book, they wanted to ask Jack while we got him here? Oh, here's one. Charlene, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute. You have to unmute yourself. Unmute. While she's figuring out how to unmute, did anyone else have any questions or comments?
Let me just interject here. A few chapters from the end, there's a scene where they're hanging out. It's like 2 a.m. and they're smoking cigarettes outside the bar. And the guy says, you should get out while you can, right? Because this place is a trap. That's such an interesting counter thesis, I thought. That's fascinating.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
It's just kind of a throwaway scene, but it really stuck me.
Me too.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's funny, and it's funny how sort of life and literature works. I think, I wrote that scene before I really understood it and understood what that character was saying, the whole get out while you can sentiment. And, now having lived in the UP a couple of years, and I'm thinking I'm moving away to going back to college soon. I kind of understand it a little more in a sort of ironically, in a way that I'm glad I was in a very pure headspace writing the book and like totally enamored with the UP and in love with it. But that sentiment holds true for just about everybody I've ever met, especially young people who are living up there for one reason or another. That, it looks incredibly beautiful when you're not stranded there. But the second you're stranded there, it gets pretty claustrophobic, and the beauty sort of drains out of a lot of things in a really sad way that I think is distinctly modern, And, now that I'm actually sort of departing the UP, at least temporarily, I think I understand it a little bit more. Like there were times recently where I would, cross the bridge over Green Bay and get into Milwaukee and see the buildings in Milwaukee and just breathe a sigh of relief. Like, thank goodness I'm back in the first world, which is something that I definitely didn't feel, during the time I was writing this book. And it's a double-edged sword, but looking back, I'm so grateful I included that scene, because I think it really gives voice to the truth that a lot of people really feel, who are up there for good, for one reason or another, perhaps not necessarily against their will, but circumstances can conspire to keep you in a place. And I think for people for whom circumstances have conspired to keep them in the UP for a long time, a real resentment can start to build. And again, just like everything, it's a double-edged sword. You get the natural beauty, you get the space and the quiet and the clean air, but it also gets lonely, and if you're young, speaking again, like I'm 26, there aren't a whole lot of other 26-year-olds, in the Houghton area for me to hang out with, and even the ones there are college students who go away, for every break and every summer. And so again, I think every coin has two sides, and that's something that I think literature is really responsible for depicting, sort of in all aspects of life, that with every heads comes a tails, and with every piece of intense natural beauty usually comes a kind of loneliness. And when loneliness isn't a problem, you can appreciate the natural beauty. But when loneliness is a problem, we're only human. Sometimes all we can think about is our own loneliness. And sometimes all we can think about is our own desire to be seen and heard and felt and be in a crowd. And if all you want to do is be in a crowd or go to a concert or be jostling shoulder to shoulder at a really, really good party, sometimes even the most beautiful sunset can't mean anything, or even the most beautiful view on the lake, or even the most, the most beautiful sort of, section of snowy woods that you've got all to yourself. If it's not what you want, you can't necessarily appreciate it for what it is. So thank you for mentioning that, Victor. Yeah, and I'm really, really glad that scene went the way it did, and that scene made it into the final cut.
Mm-hmm. I know Charlene had a question. I don't see her in the screen. Here she's popping back. Go ahead, Charlene.
I lost my visual. I got the audio, but not the visual. No, the only thing which I was wondering was if you are Native American. You were talking about the Native Americans before, and it kind of ran across my mind maybe that you were.
No, I'm not one bit Native American. I read a lot of Jim Harrison, who had great, intense admiration for Indigenous Americans. So I've read a lot of literature. I guess he's white, so not necessarily Native American literature, but I've read a lot of literature about the Native peoples across the United States, or across North America before it was the United States. But no, I'm not one bit Native American.
How about Finnish?
I'm not one bit Finnish either. Those are just my friends and neighbors as well.
Wow.
I didn't get too far with the book. I'm about halfway done, but I know there are Finnish people and going back a few years and thing. But I'm really glad that in the book so far that I'm reading, you are talking about some of the history, like when they had the disaster with the kids in the in Calumet.
Italian Hall.
Yes, the Italian Hall. I'm glad you are bringing up some of the history as you go along in the book. I'm enjoying the book, and I'm enjoying.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Real quick, before anybody else has a question, hand up accountability. the climactic scene with the rings in the tree is totally inspired by a section in Aldo Leopold's The Sand County Almanac, where two farmers are themselves cutting a tree down with a crosscut saw, and its section lasts a lot longer, and it's very different tonally. And I'll stand by the originality of my scene, but the idea, again, hand up accountability, comes directly from that scene in Aldo Leopold's The Sand County Almanac, which everybody should read. It's a great sort of appreciation of Wisconsin back in the day from a man who was anticipating exactly where industrialized society was going. Aldo Leopold was people call him the one of the founding fathers of conservationism, the term is leaving me, or is escaping me for a second. Environmental ethics, that's what it is. He's one of the founding fathers of environmental ethics, and he was talking about conserving land and protecting natural resources a long, long time before those sentiments made it to the public. So yeah, shout out to Aldo Leopold. That climactic scene did totally come from a Sand County Almanac, but again, I stand by its originality and emotional tone.
I have a question for you. You said you are not from the UP. Where are you from?
I was born in Springfield, Illinois, and raised in St. Louis, Missouri.
Okay.
I didn't.
It's funny, like, when you were saying how, when you drove down to Milwaukee and you saw the big buildings and the, graffiti or whatever, and you felt like, oh, I'm in the first world. I looked over to Shelly there, and she was shaking her head, no, no, no. So it was like, I was kind of thinking, I think there is a difference definitely between people from the UP who've been born here and lived there their whole life, like myself, and maybe people who've been implanted for some time. So I thought that was kind of an interesting point there that you brought up.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I think that
I grew up between the Detroit area and the UP, and I would stay in the UP any day.
Any day. I could tell when you said that, your face, I could tell, Shelly.
Yeah. I don't mind going to visit those big cities, but I always want to come back across that dang bridge.
I hope before we get to Mary's question, I hope that Jack comes back and writes more. And you have to tell us about your second book too, but go ahead, Mary.
I just really wanted to second the motion on Aldo Leopold. That book really changed my life. And also where I am now, living in Kalispell, Montana, I'm seeing, the beauty being stripped away by industrialization, commercialization. We have had a 25% increase in population in the last 5 years. And the city is just mushrooming, and it's making me very depressed because it's taking away my contact with the land and being able to look at the mountains and say, but look what they're doing to them now. And I have to fight traffic jams just to go to the grocery store. And so I can, it's like I came back to Montana because it was my contact with nature, and that's being taken away from me. So I can really relate to what you were talking about, even though it was a different place. So I had to say that. Thank you for your book.
Absolutely. Thank you for reading it. Thank you for the time and attention and your comments. I really appreciate it.
You've got another book. Can you tell us about your other book that's out? It just got published, I think, recently.
Absolutely. No, once again, incredibly grateful to Victor for giving me the opportunity. Modern History Press just published my second book, which is a collection of short stories called What You Find in the Woods and Other Stories. They were sort of the stories that I worked on sort of one at a time while I was writing The Last Huck. I did The Last Huck in 2 drafts over the course of 2 or 3 winters. And when I was taking a break in the summertime, I would write short stories. And they're not all set in the UP. Most of them are. But a lot of them are deeply are homages to my short story heroes, Raymond Carver and Dennis Johnson and Flannery O'Connor, especially Flannery O'Connor, Laurie Moore, Jay McInerney in places with the second person. I think they're a little haphazard thematically. I don't think that takes away from them, but they're really, again, they're about young men, except one story, which is from the perspective of a woman, but they're primarily about young men who are really struggling with, their sanity and their place in the world, and sort of the philosophical question of like, is my insanity my problem, or is it the world's problem? And does that even matter, because it's my sanity anyway, so I need to make it my problem, and does that mean I need to bend the knee and sort of acquiesce to society, or do I stand by my individuality at the expense of my own comfort? I think the first story in the collection, it's one of my favorites. It's called The Bottom of the Cider Barrel. It's about a woman and her husband at the end of their life, and she sort of recounts their long, decades-long marriage as she's sort of going to her deathbed. And that story's in the second person, which is inspired by McInerney and Laurie Moore. And I think that story really gets to the essence of really what I love writing about most, about love and life, and how do you make sense of the kind of tragedies that come with being human, and what do you do in the face of death, and what do you do in the face of death of loved ones, and what do you do in the face of, coming to the end of something. But I think the stories, again, in addition to all those other things, I think the stories are explorations of what is the source of the discontent and ill temper of young people right now. Again, I'm 26, so these stories are mostly about young people, except that one, The Bottom of the Cider Barrel. And even The Bottom of the Cider Barrel a lot of it is about this elderly couple when they were young and falling in love and being young people together, and then remembering being young people as old people. And I think, young people are really having a very hard time with all sorts of things right now, especially mental health. And while any individual's mental health is that individual's responsibility, I think the collective's, frankly, tragically poor mental health, is kind of society's fault. Not to just put it so bluntly, but I think if one person is having very, very serious problems, that's that person's problem. But if we're kind of all having very, very, very similar problems, the way we're setting our lives up is kind of sick and kind of twisted. And I think these stories, all from their own separate angles, ask sort of the question of like, what's, not necessarily what do we do about this, but sort of, geez, how did we go so wrong? One of my favorite stories in the collection is called What You Find in the Woods, the title story, What You Find in the Woods. And it's about a man who lives in northern Wisconsin, and a group of his young friends who come up from Chicago to visit him for the weekend. And they're all doughy-eyed about the North Woods, and they're all doughy-eyed to get in a cabin and get away from the city and go snowshoeing and go ice fishing and be away from the city, and not to ruin it. But by the end of the story, as his friends are driving out of the driveway to go back to Chicago, this guy starts thinking sort of to himself, and in sort of in a way, it's an homage to Flannery O'Connor, the twist at the end, where you spend the whole story thinking, oh, things are going a certain way, and everybody's doughy-eyed about the North Woods, and everybody's just sort of glazing about being in the natural world and being away from the city. But at the end, what you realize is the person who lives up there, his name is Jay in the story, the person who lives up there is desperate to get back to the city, and desperate to not be so lonely, and desperate to not be chopping his own wood, and desperate to not be so cold all the time, and desperate to live in a house with central heating and to be able to walk to a corner bar. And it all sort of turns on its head in the last paragraph, where he sees his friends driving down the driveway back to Chicago, and he thinks, geez, maybe I can get my old job back in the bike shop back in Chicago. And I think those ironies, sort of like that scene in The Last Huck where the guy says, hey, get out while you can. I think those ironies abound in the UP and abound in the North Woods, and, I think for every person, perhaps this is more pervasive among young people right now, but I think for every person who travels to the UP and thinks, man, this is amazing, I want to move here, there's a person who lives in the UP, probably a young person, who, whenever they hear that kind of glazing over how beautiful it is and how they never want to leave, think, yeah, just wait until you're here permanently, and like maybe wait until you're stuck here to see how you feel. So again, I think there are two sides to those coins. And I think the short stories, again, it's called What You Find in the Woods and Other Stories, published by Modern History Press. I think those stories, they all really exist at the sort of pinch point of urban and rural, and at the pinch point of young and old, and at the pinch point of male and female. And they kind of ask, like, what do we do about this tension, again, as young people who are growing old, or as old people who are remembering being young, or as rural people wishing they could just have company in society, and urban people just wishing they could have natural beauty. And I don't think I prescribe very much. I don't think they're very prescriptive stories, but I think they really explore those tensions and sort of where those tensions come from.
I'm excited to read it, and we have it here at the Crystal Falls Library. You can interlibrary loan it. We'll send it to you if anyone's interested in the book, and hopefully other libraries and bookstores will be getting the book as well. I do want to mention somebody who's on, because I believe you, if I'm not mistaken, you what's the word I'm looking for? You dedicated your book to your father, am I correct?
To my grandmother, Ann Lewis Austin.
Your grandmother. Okay. But I think, is your father on the call? Could we just say hi to him?
Perhaps he is somewhere.
There he is. I met him at Marquette at the UPPAA conference, and I thought you all might like to see him. He's Jack's dad, and it's nice that you were here listening to your son talk about his books.
Can I just say, I'm not going to turn the camera to Jack's grandmother, to whom The Last Huck is dedicated, but she is to my right, listening intently. I'm in her room.
Good.
And
Nice.
she's here, and she's here. That's all.
Well, I think it's really nice that she had you, and it's really nice you had him, because he's a good writer. And I think Victor is very smart to pick up his books, because I don't know, Jack. I read a lot of books. English teacher for 24 years, librarian for 6. Yours are very good. It's a very good book.
Thank you so much.
I really think we got something special here, Victor. What do you say?
Absolutely. He's I wish I had a dozen just like him.
Yes. It's good. It's really nice. So do we have any concluding comments, questions?
I have a question for Jack.
And then we'll get one from Alex, who's down calling for Bayless.
Violence keeps playing a role in the book. Do you see it as like an intergenerational thing that the son inherits from the father and so on? Is that trying to break the cycle of violence? I was just curious.
To a certain extent, I suppose. It's funny. I didn't exactly go into the book, trying to weave it intergenerationally. I think violence is just sort of part of being male in a little bit. I think it eventually, when the book was coming into its final form, I was a little more intentional with it. But like, I grew up wrestling with my buddies in the woods, and I think that wrestling was a little less violent than the fighting that they were doing 40 years ago. And the fighting they were doing 40 years ago was a little less violent than they were doing 40 years before that. I think we've gotten a little bit less violent as the years have gone by, but we're definitely still violent. And so I think in the book, it worked out perhaps even better than I could have hoped, that the violence is tempered by the end, but it never really goes away. And I think violence is something that, especially in the North Woods, is part of the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. And it's hard because there's redemption in battle, and there's great catharsis in battle, but it also leaves us wounded and injured and angry. And I think the physical violence in the book kind of mirrors the sort of internal battles that are going on. The do we or don't we? Should we stay or should we go? How do we handle this? That comes out physically. And I think that happens a lot in real life, that people's internal trauma and internal sort of distress comes out in physical violence. And so I think that it was something that I just sort of had to write about. And it's also hard not to be romantic about violence in the North Woods, and how bar fights used to be bigger and bloodier than they are now. And how, even though the bar fights used to be bigger and bloodier, when you get a group of boys out in the woods and they're all drinking together, eventually they're going to end up wrestling, and eventually, once they end up wrestling, somebody's going to get hurt in a way that they didn't anticipate. And that's something I've wrestled with my buddies after a night of drinking in the North Woods. And so it was just something that was so essential to the story of men, and especially young men in the North Woods, that I just had to write about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alex from Bayless had a question.
Yeah, just kind of a comment, really. I do adult programs and marketing at Bayless, and so we have been projecting these or putting these on in our community room. So thank you guys so much. It's been really great. It's just me here tonight, but I just usually I don't hop on because it's kind of weird with the audio and video, and it's just I'm usually sitting out there. But I wanted to hop on this one. I have not read the book yet, but just this conversation and hearing your perspective on things as a young person myself, born and raised in the UP, and then recently moved back. Just like so many things out of this conversation really rang true to me. So yeah, I wanted to thank you, and thank you guys for putting this on. It's definitely my next read now.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Thank you, everybody. Any final comments, questions? Okay, I'm kind of scanning. Well, I really appreciate the conversation, and I thank you to your father and to your grandma who were there listening. I'm glad that you're a part of this. And next month we will be meeting to talk about how to hike the North Country Trail. My book is checked out, but it looks like this. So it's always the second Thursday at 6 o'clock Central, 7 o'clock Eastern. I hope everybody enjoys June and it warms up a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for reading. Have a great day. And please, thank you so much for your time and your attention.
You've been watching the UP Notable Books Club, brought to you by the Upper Peninsula Publisher and Authors Association. To join or for more information, please visit us at www.uppa.org or www.upnotable.com.